In recent years, the Supreme Court of the United States has been mired in controversy, from unpopular rulings and a possible ideological rift to perceived ethics scandals. As public opinion of the High Court dwindles and many lawmakers call for reform, President Joe Biden last month shared his plan to address the issue, and he says to improve America's trust in the justices.
My fellow Americans, based on all my experience, I'm certain we need these reforms. We need these reforms to restore trust in the courts, preserve the system of checks and balances that are vital to our democracy. They're also common sense reforms that the vast majority of the American people support, as well as leading constitutional law scholars, progressives and conservatives.
President Biden first turned his attention to court reform at the beginning of his term when he organized the Presidential Commission for the Supreme Court of the United States. The group consisted of legal experts from across the political spectrum who met throughout 2021 to discuss possible court reforms. The commission released its findings in a final report at the end of that year. President Biden's new proposals for reform are based off the findings of that commission. He called for an 18-year term limit for justices, with a new justice appointed every 2 years. A code of conduct and ethics similar to one for federal judges, which also would call for justices to recuse themselves from cases in which they or their spouse have a conflict of interest. Biden is also calling for a constitutional amendment that grants former presidents no immunity for crimes committed in office. This reform is in response to the justices' ruling last term that presidents have immunity from prosecution for, quote, official acts. The push for Supreme Court reform comes after years of controversy. Concerns over a partisan bench came to a head after former President Donald Trump appointed 3 conservative judges. The court has released numerous landmark rulings reversing Roe v. Wade, ending affirmative action, and lessening the power of federal agencies. Also, Justices Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito have come under fire for failing to disclose large gifts from wealthy donors. Public opinion on the court has faltered in response to these controversies. Recent Pew Research found that fewer than half of Americans view the Supreme Court favorably, a near historic low. For analysis of this renewed attention on reforming the Supreme Court, we are joined by one of the legal experts who served on the commission and contributed to its final report. Adam White is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Adam, welcome back to the program. What is your reaction to these proposed reforms? Does it address what the Presidential Commission studied and determined in 2021?
Well, thanks, Catherine. I agree that public trust in the court is indispensable. It always has been. It's important for the court to uphold the public's trust. But I think the so-called reforms that have been proposed around the court and against the court are deeply mistaken.
President Biden proposed, as I mentioned, an 18-year term limit for justices. Take a listen to what he had to say.
Term limits will help ensure that the court membership changes with some regularity. That would make timing for the court's nomination more predictable and less arbitrary. Reduce the chance that any single presidency imposes undue influence in generations to come.
Adam, what's your reaction? You recently wrote that this is just a repackaging of what is known as court packing.
Right. It's an issue I studied closely in my time on the Presidential Commission. I was honored to be appointed by President Biden, but I think this proposal is a big mistake. Supreme Court justices, like all federal judges, have always had life tenure under our Constitution. It protects their independence, and it also protects us from justices sort of looking over the horizon at what their next job would be and where they'll have the rest of their career. We don't want that. We want judges who will commit themselves to life tenure and do the best possible job they can with full independence. Appointing justices to an 18-year term would complicate all of that. And also on this point of spreading appointments off evenly across the president's 4-year terms, there too, I think it's a mistake. It treats justices on the Supreme Court like they're just spoils of a presidential election, that every president is somehow automatically entitled to 2 Supreme Court justices, sends exactly the wrong message to the public. I think it would actually undermine the public's trust in the court when we treat them as nothing more than just the fruits of a presidential election victory for one party or the other.
I think an 18-year term limit would also conveniently mean a few conservative justices would be off the bench right now. President Biden also suggested a new code of ethics for justices. Explain the ethical guidelines that Chief Justice John Roberts recently announced for justices. How does it differ from the code of conduct a federal judge must follow?
Well, the Supreme Court, since it's created by the Constitution, has always had independence in setting its own ethical standards. Again, judicial ethics are incredibly important, and the justices need to take it seriously. The other federal courts are not created by the Constitution. They're created by Congress, and so Congress has always asserted a greater role in prescribing and enforcing the ethical standards for those judges. Giving Congress the power over the Supreme Court to set ethics rules, to hold oversight hearings, things like that, would, I think, raise real problems under the separation of powers. It would create incentives for politicians to constantly harass justices about supposed ethics problems, calling for oversight hearings, and so on. Again, judicial ethics are incredibly important. The judges have to at all times be careful about these ethical rules and always stay on the right side of them. But making politicians the umpires of these issues is, once again, the best way to actually make problems worse.
These reforms do need congressional approval. Do you think they will ever advance, or are they, quote, dead on arrival, as House Speaker Mike Johnson called them?
Well, they're not going anywhere right now, but of course, we're on the eve of a presidential and congressional election cycle. So much remains to be seen as to where things settle after the election. And if Democrats control the White House and both houses of Congress, of course, the filibuster still stands in the way, but there will be a new debate.
Well, to that point, expanding on that even further, can you speak to how could the election and our future president shape the court?
Well, we don't know where Kamala Harris stands on this issue. President Biden was a lifelong critic of many of these proposals until recent months. So we'd have to see where Kamala Harris is on this. And also, even for Democratic senators, it's not clear that all Democratic senators would agree on this. We had Democratic senators who seemed opposed to them in the current Congress. And so it's not just which party wins control of Congress and the White House. It really will come down to the individual preferences and temperaments of the specific senators and members of Congress.
Adam, you've already hit on this somewhat, but just to underline it, do you think these reforms that have been proposed, would they improve public opinion of the court?
No, not at all. I think it would make official the assumption that the Supreme Court seats are just gifts to be handed out by a president after an election cycle, and that each president is entitled to a certain number of Supreme Court seats. As I said in my closing statement on President Biden's Supreme Court commission, right now is a good time for all three branches of our federal government, the Congress, the courts, and the president, to look inward for opportunities to reform themselves and restore the public's trust in each part of government. But that's a task for every part of government, including the courts, to carry out for itself. And we don't want to put the courts under the political control of Congress.
Adam White, we so appreciate your expertise on this. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.